And I think we'll do Q&A, and I'm probably going to repeat your questions or at least summarize them just so we have them for the audio recording. But please, anyone feel free to ask. In the back. Yeah, that was probably my fault. I usually have 2 slides at the beginning of my presentation where I define effective altruism, but I thought that this would, people would be more familiar with it. Yeah, so effective altruism is just the idea of doing the most good, broadly. It's really that simple. It's almost deceptively so. But it could be broken down maybe into 2 parts to understand it better. One is the perspective you take. So effective altruists tend to take a very global, broad perspective, sometimes referred to as the point of view of the universe. So we want to not just consider the people in our neighborhood or in our village, not even just consider the people in our country, but consider, the global poor in low-income countries. Consider individuals of other species like farmed animals, and also consider people who don't even exist yet. So what kind of world are we leaving for our children, which could lead you to something like environmentalism or this sort of issue. And then the second facet is openness to evidence and this critical thinking aspect of not just saying, well, I love everyone, I want to help everyone, but then saying, how do I actually do that in practice as effectively as I can? This means looking at the scientific evidence. This means being willing to change your mind. For a long time, I was focused on helping the global poor. I was involved in effective altruism since its very early days, and that seemed very compelling naturally, just because a dollar can go so much farther overseas. But eventually, I just heard really good arguments for focusing on farmed animals. So I decided to switch my resources to that. And other people have made similar transitions in the movement, and I'm still open to doing so. A few years from now, I might be working in another area because I've had this agility. You can also incorporate this when planning your career. So for example, if you want to build up some sort of financial capital or influence capital by becoming like a politician, then that's useful in a variety of cause areas. Whereas if you've just built up a really good skill at handing out vegan leaflets, then that's great, vegan leaflets are awesome, but what if you decided that's not as effective? Then maybe you should have been building skills in other areas. So yeah, 2 main facets, but ultimately it's just about doing the most good. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Great. Yeah.
I was wondering about the 2 graph. Isn't it possible to do both? To both do the speed and then after you do it faster, you can make it go higher?
Yeah. So is it possible to affect both of these with your activism or your donations or what have you? So affect the speed, and then whenever we get to this point, then focus on making sure we get as high as possible for the long run. I think that's true, and it brings up a really important point about effective altruism thinking in general, which is most of the time we need to think on the margin. So not think about what do I do with my entire career even, or what do we do as a movement. Because as a movement, I don't want everyone to focus on online ads, I don't want everyone to focus on institutional reform or anything like this. But instead what I want to think about is with this one kind of action I have today, with this one action I have maybe with my career or with my, at least the next 5 years, which one do I need to focus on? And unfortunately, we don't have the resources for me to do kind of all forms of activism, so to focus on both the speed and the direction. So I really do have to face some sort of prioritization decision and make a decision about which one of those is best. Of course, if there were an intervention, so let's say animal-free food, this gets really complicated very easily, but I discussed the cognitive dissonance thing, and just having people eat vegan food can help them think more of animals and build a better long-term future. So maybe you think that animal-free foods affects both of these really well, then that's great. There's sort of like 2 criteria, and you see how well that intervention scores on each of them. And if it's a 10 out of 10 in both, great, that's probably the most promising intervention. But I think in practice it ends up that most things are either an 8 out of 10 here and a 2 out of 10 here, or vice versa, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I have been wondering really much about the lab-made meat. I feel like donating or investing money in that kind of project is how I could contribute the best or something. So that's why I found this interesting, because to me, I think without enough experience, that seems like the most effective way to make more people go vegan.
Yeah, so I think in the short run of just like how many vegans are there in the next 5 years, I think it's pretty compelling that animal-free food is like the way to go. It's again unclear like how do donations work in this area. But if, for example, you are just starting your college degree and you can go into any career you want, and you're really keen on like science, then maybe becoming a scientist in this field is really impactful. But if you already have that science background, so let's say you're a tissue engineer, you've been working with like regenerative medicine and for burn victims or something, then you have a really strong comparative advantage for working in animal-free food. So maybe that is the best for you. Also, if you have a comparative advantage in another area, like you've been leafleting for a long time with, political advocacy groups to get people to go vote, then maybe you can really easily transition into that. So you have to consider that sort of thing. But yeah, lots of good arguments for and against animal-free food. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, I think you had your hand up first. But.
No, I was really quick now, so I don't think that was first.
Okay, you can go and then you.
Just a quick question. Do you have any global organizations to recommend which are very effective in animal rights?
Yeah, what do you mean by global? Do you just mean international or actually like very large and around the whole globe?
Yeah, like where people have actually checked how effective they are. Because I know they've done that in like the organizations that are working for humans.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't remember if I've seen anyone for animals.
Yeah, so that's I'm not talking as much about my organization in this talk, but that's what we do. That's what Animal Charity Evaluators does primarily. Oh, sorry. The question was, are there like globally recommended, really effective charities in the animal space? Have people done evaluations of that, like they've done for the global poor, helping the global poor, or helping humans in general? So ACE recommends 3 top charities right now. All of them are international: Mercy for Animals, the Humane League, and Animal Equality. If you go to our website, Animal Charity Evaluators, I don't have it on here, then you can find lots more information about each of those organizations. We also have extensive reviews about them where you can like find lots of details. So, yeah. These groups. I don't think any of them are working in Norway. However, Mercy for Animals, actually all of them right now are working to expand corporate policy change, which is both to increase welfare and also to increase plant-based options in Europe right now. Because we had a lot of successful cage-free reforms in the US, and now we want to expand those globally, first to Europe and then to other places like China and India. Mm-hmm.
I actually had a follow-up question to these graphs, but maybe we can discuss it afterwards. Because I just wonder because I've heard about them before in different EA talks, but like who came up with them and what's the reason behind them? Because I have all these critical questions.
Sorry, the speed and direction one?
Yeah.
Um,
Because for the direction, it just seems so easy that, okay, now I made a big difference and that will last for eternity. Like, it could be 2 years and then Trump or some other person comes along and then you're down again. So
yeah.
it seems a bit too easy to say that, okay, now I made a change for the entire future.
Yeah, so the question was about the speed and direction graphs and where do these originate? And then the specific question was about what happens if Trump comes along and takes your progress and then dips it down. So definitely those graphs are, I'll answer the second one first. Those graphs are simplifications. In reality, they're like probability distributions, and you would say that like, well, really progress is like this all the time, and it trends upwards and then trends downwards, but it's like fluctuating all the time. And really, whenever we're improving the world through social change, we're just making it more likely that it's higher. So we're saying that Trump could still come along in either situation. We're making it such that if Trump comes along, it goes down to here instead of down to here. We're making it maybe a little less likely that Trump comes along, this sort of thing. But yeah, if I were truly doing those graphs, and so that those specific ones were just made by me in like a couple weeks ago in Google Slides. I don't know who else has them. I don't.
Yeah, and it's also the thing about just making things speed up. Like it sounds very much like it's giving that, meet what you call it, that it's given that it will happen, and that might be the case sometimes, but it's a bit hard to distinguish because that graph also goes to a higher point.
Yeah. So I think there's a good argument to be made that cultured meat is not inevitable, and that we do actually have to work a lot on it. I think lots of people are involved now. I think it's already a field, and I think it's with most technologies, they do get developed kind of no matter what. This doesn't apply unilaterally, of course, because like there's the technology of having, I don't know, like a bicycle-powered water bottle drinking tool. That, like, you ride a bicycle and then it, like you get to drink a water bottle. Like, nobody's probably going to invent that because it's not very useful. But lots of people have the idea of cultured meat, and it seems like a technology that's kind of on track to succeed. It seems like there would have to be something like pretty big to have it not happen. Like, society as a whole just generally stops caring about the issue, or we have some big natural disaster or some political disaster that makes people like not do technology stuff anymore, or we have like an authoritarian government that keeps us from doing it. People have speculated about this, but yeah, it seems unlikely, but maybe there's a case for it. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
You were first. You raised that your hand earlier, so if you want, you can go first.
Could you make the case that there needs to be better data, better research, and that if so, more money going into research would make these groups much more effective?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the argument that I ultimately buy, at least with my professional work, if not my donations.
So why does ACE not promote Faunalytics, for example?
So Faunalytics is a special case. A lot of their research is not effectiveness research, or at least not directly. So it's not like randomized control trials for interventions. And there are lots of other. I mean, we have an entire review on them. They're a standout charity. So we have 2 tiers. I think it's actually so these are also like really exciting groups. But yeah, we had some concerns about Faunalytics that made them not go into the top one. Of course, the other question is, why don't we recommend ourselves? We have an obvious conflict of interest there, but we are excited about that. We allow kind of third parties to make their own decisions about whether to give to us. I think if we had to take a view, we would say like, yeah, you should donate to us, because we maybe have some multiplier because we're fundraising for these groups. So $1 towards us creates more than $1 for them. So we're definitely excited about research.
Well, I wondered, would you agree with my armchair evaluation that the data is really terrible?
Yes. I mean, terrible is like vague and relative to what, but yes.
There's like silos in information. We know recidivism. We know that people who go vegan quickly tend to quit. But we don't really connect all the dots. We don't know if the same people who quit are the same people that we had this effective campaign for, etc. We're just sort of guessing, I think.
Yeah. So it's definitely terrible in the sense that it's like way worse than the evidence we have for global poverty in terms of behavior change. So like for Development Media International, who's like getting people to have more healthful behaviors, or the evidence for malaria nets and their effect on malaria, relative to other forms of social change. So like relative to the evidence for creating like new people who exercise in the health field and stuff, maybe it's not so bad. I think the evidence in that area as a whole is terrible. It's also just really hard to do research. So I think the concerns with research are not in terms of neglectedness. I think everyone agrees that we have really crappy research. It's just how much can we improve. So for example, if we think that the most effective things are these institutional reforms, then maybe research isn't as much of a priority because we already have good evidence of the impact of those. And we can't run RCTs on companies, for example. But yeah, I would agree it's terrible evidence, and hopefully we'll improve some of it soon. And just to mention this, there's a collaboration going on right now with $1 million going towards effective animal advocacy research. That funding, I think, is starting to be distributed right now. We've had a lot of really good proposals for it. So there should be more RCTs in this area before too long. Yeah, good question.
I have a question and then a follow-up question to that. So would you say for effective altruists, the goal is to prevent animal suffering, or also to help more animals to have a happier and more fulfilling life?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The question is, sorry, I'm bad at this. Do effective altruists in the animal area want to just reduce suffering, or would they also like to create more either years of happy life or more animals living happy lives or something like this? So there's no consensus on it. One of the, I think, really good things about effective altruism is it's not committed to specific ethical views in that sense. I'd say most animal activists take the view that, at least in practice, there's so much suffering for animals and it's so easily reduced. Even with the most pessimistic estimates based on the research, it's just so impactful to reduce that suffering that maybe our priority right now shouldn't be increasing the number of happy lives. Of course, I know a lot of people who actually take the ethical position that it's not a morally urgent thing to do, at least, or even a morally good thing to create new happy lives. Instead, it's just about reducing suffering. So this is like a negative consequentialist or a negative utilitarian. Some people are just negative leaning. So for example, they say that when you survey people and ask them, if you could have X number of years of being very happy, living in a utopia, but at the end of it, you had 1 minute of like being burned alive. How many years would you have to be offered in order to take that trade-off? Many people say just no amount. Like, I just would not accept that deep amount of suffering. I think that's a really compelling case. Personally, I'm a total hedonistic utilitarian. I think there is some number of years. It's probably in like the billions or something. I think it's very large, but I don't personally think that there's a threshold or a categorical difference between hedonic experiences. If people aren't following this, I can definitely explain it later.
Maybe you can translate it in animal rights terms, because it's very compelling. It creates a lot of dilemmas in terms of farming. Is it possible to have human farming or
humane farming, right?
Humane farming, yeah. As humane as
English.
Humanitarian, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So, for example, by choosing to produce animal-free meat, we are of course preventing animals to suffer. However, we are also preventing many of them to have a happy fulfillment.
Yeah, so empirically, I think the vast majority, in farmed animal, in practice, how does this flesh out when we think about promoting animal-free food and actually ending animal farming versus just having farms where animals live happy lives, having humane farms? I think that so few animals live lives worth living. So few animals live lives where I would expect if you were to give them the option of living that life or not existing at all, they would take that life. I had that giant list of suffering earlier. And even if we just consider, the forms that exist everywhere, like the slaughter itself and this sort of thing, it's still, I think, really, really bad. However, there are probably some cows in some countries that I think live lives worth living. And then, of course, some other animals on like small family farms who probably do. But that's just such a small minority of animal farming. And I think that we really can't make that nuanced distinction for the general public in an impactful way. So if we tell people, oh, we just need to there's this qualification to us wanting to promote animal-free foods, that yes, we're okay with some farming, then we get this really big issue where people take psychological refuge in that fact. I talk to tons of people who say don't worry, I only buy happy meat. I'm not going to go vegan, but it's okay because I only buy from the best farms. And then you ask them what they do in practice, and they're like, oh yeah, last month I bought from a farmer's market, and I think they had a picture of a happy cow, on their stand. And then you say, okay, well, did you go out to eat recently? And yeah, I went out last night. And I'm like, okay, what farm was the animal product from? And they don't know. It's just so hard in practice to actually implement that, but it's so easy to use that as an excuse to not make changes and this sort of thing. So I'm really concerned about it. And then I think in practice, to actually feed a global population with animal farming, you just have huge sustainability and other issues, and it's very expensive to actually have humane farms because you'd have to have chickens who grow more slowly, for example, which means you have to spend more time housing them and doing these other sorts of things, and the costs really stack up. So ultimately I think we should have a message of end animal farming, even if in theory I think some animal farming could be ethical. But effective altruists as a whole is not committed to any specific view there. Several people, I'm not keeping track very well, sorry, but maybe you?
In EA-UIO, we have been discussing a lot about whether we should promote vegetarianism or flexitarianism. Has there been done any research on that question?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I have strong views on many, many questions. I do not have strong views on that one. Should we promote a reducitarian or flexitarian message or a more vegetarian one or even a vegan one, specifically in the context of effective altruism here in Norway? Yeah, I don't have a strong view on that. I think right now in the US, there's been a lot of reducitarian messaging, a lot of emphasis on like, oh, just reduce your meat consumption. You don't have to go vegan. Like veganism is a bad word. We're not even going to call ourselves vegan. That I think marginal resources could probably be better used in the stronger dietary change messaging. In Europe, again, I don't know about Norway, but at least in places like the UK or Germany, I think there's been a lot of vegan messaging, a lot of like very hardcore like veganism is the moral baseline messaging, and not nearly as much reducitarian messaging. So there at the margin, maybe I'd favor the reducitarian message. But ultimately, as I mentioned before, I think we should be focused more on the institutional approach and more on talking about getting society as a whole to stop farming and abusing animals. But yeah, I think we should incorporate a dietary change message. I think it depends on your location. I think you can also pretty well have an inclusive message. You can say in a leaflet, for example, that you should reduce or eliminate your consumption of animal products, and I think this works pretty well. I think that's the favored approach by many organizations. As to whether there's research going on right now, the study that actually came out earlier today was tackling this question. They didn't find a significant difference between the reducitarian versus the vegetarian approach. They just found a significant impact for both of those relative to the control group. But I presume that there's going to be more research on it. I think there's even a couple things lined up with the research funding that I discussed earlier. So maybe we'll have a better answer before too long. Yeah.
To clarify on that, are you saying that when they promote reducitarianism, that people go reduce or that they go vegan?
You mean what's the outcome of that study?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the study that I discussed with reducitarian versus vegetarian, the primary outcome was number of servings of animal products consumed. And that is where they found a statistically significant difference between the control group and the treatment groups, but not between the reducitarian and the vegetarian groups. Yeah. Yeah, so some people would argue that maybe having more vegans is more impactful, and that should really be our outcome variable because it could lead to more activism as compared to reducitarians, for example. One of the issues there is that so few people will actually go vegan because of these messages that it's very hard to get, actually like robust, statistically significant evidence. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering about awareness as well and the institutional way of doing it. Is it something that is in a school for younger as well, like in a principle, how can you say it? Normal school, I'm not talking about the private schools or like the public school. Is it anything that's going that way that we want to teach our children, or like that is not by giving them like I'm not saying by influencing or like scaring them, but like is it anything that is done to on this side at that age or at that moment already?
Yeah, so the question was about are people reaching out to young children, specifically not in terms of like scaring them, but in showing them that there are good plant-based options out there. Was that right?
Yeah, or like just more about the awareness about the world when you're at school and you're just not getting ready to be effective in a social life, but to have an awareness about what is around you and what's the impact of humanity, let's say. Yeah,
so there actually is that. There's something called humane education, which is very popular in the US, popular in some other places too. People have tried to even implement like actual courses around it, but usually it's groups doing lectures, going around, getting school teachers to let them in. And one of the things about this is that school teachers are very averse to you showing graphic footage or anything close to that to children. So they end up being very general, maybe too general, some people have argued. So they talk about, being a global citizen and this is great and we should love animals. And they like try as much as they can to like emphasize there are lots of farmed animals like suffering or having their rights violated and like we should make a difference about them. So that's the most popular intervention that I know of. Definitely some of the new animal-free food companies are considering schools in promoting their products. And especially if you have some promotion around this and you tell them like it's Meatless Mondays, for example, and you're going to eat plant-based today. And they can accept it as like, oh, this is a normal thing that you can do, that I can do potentially whenever I'm making my own food choices down the road and this sort of thing. Yeah, those are maybe the two main angles I've seen on it. Mm-hmm.
Just a quick comment. Actually, animal welfare is in the Norwegian curriculum. I work for a Norwegian animal welfare organization, the Norwegian Animal Protection Alliance, Dyreverналliansen. And we worked on this for years, and we got the animal welfare into the curriculum for the 4th grade. And we also have a sister organization, Dyreverналliansen, which is specifically for children, making educational material that can be downloaded by teachers online for free.
Cool. Yeah.
Very quick question. You had this one slide with this scale. Of,
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that online somewhere? And where did you get the data?
Yeah. Let's see. Why? It is online. I don't think it's on the ACE website anymore, but I think I wrote a blog post. And I forgot what it was called, but I think it's something like this. Yeah. And it has it. Yeah, it's pretty close. The numbers are a little bit off because I corrected them for this presentation. And it has a link to this graph. So this is the one that's actually on the ACE website. And this has the breakdown. We haven't published the charts. So one of the issues here is that at least for the allocations of donations, it involves specific charity figures, which we don't always want to be public about because they're not public knowledge. Also, if we get them wrong, we could get in a lot of trouble. And like we're just trying to get a rough figure. Like it doesn't matter whether we're $10 off for an organization that's millions of dollars. But yeah, I guess this would be the best reference. So this web page called Number of Animals versus Amount of Donations. So it talks about what are the actual figures here for the animal shelters. What are the slaughter totals? Oh, sorry. And this is for the U.S. in particular.
Okay,
Yeah.
The scale is just really mind-blowing.
Yeah.
The numbers. So, yeah, too bad. Yeah, because then maybe it's not a good idea to share it everywhere. If it's not or do you are the numbers good? Or you said you didn't want to publish it.
Oh no, the numbers are fine for that purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like we could have in our calculations that created these graphs a small error, and because we're talking about specific charities, they could like get really mad at us. So it's just one reason for us not to publish it, and we're really hesitant to be non-transparent about this sort of thing. But we felt it was good to like put this information out there, even if we couldn't put all the information out there. But it's definitely okay to share this webpage. Please do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Are quality adjusted life years transferable to animals? Or is there a rational approach to select whether to donate to animal charities or against malaria vaccination?
Yeah, so in theory, yes, qualities are transferable. Nobody has done that. Qualities wouldn't make a whole lot of sense because we think about like global poverty and farmed animals in different ways. Like with farmed animals, we think that their lives are just not worth living, so it's just about reducing their numbers. So we're kind of just trying to quantify like total suffering. Whereas with qualities or DALYs, disability adjusted life years, we're more talking about extending years of happy life for humans. So it's very hard to make those comparisons. The most rigorous analysis, I don't know how to look it up, but I can send it to you. It's somebody published it on their Facebook page. But it tries to go through and answer exactly that question. They try to do it in terms of suffering. So even though AMF Against Malaria Foundation, which reduces malaria rates, is optimizing for saving lives, keeping people from dying of malaria, specifically young children, they also just reduce the incidence of malaria. So they could have a big impact on suffering just by having fewer people have to endure malaria. Similarly, one of the interventions evaluated by GiveWell is river blindness alleviation, and this seems to just kind of purely reduce suffering. So this analysis took both of those and compared their actual suffering reduction to the suffering reduction of farmed animals. I mean, it involves so many like speculative, controversial trade-offs, like do you think humans are more sentient, and do you have some discount factor there? Do you think the evidence is just less robust for farmed animal stuff? Do you want to apply a discount rate for that? And all these sorts of things. And like, how bad is the really intense suffering of farms versus the pretty bad suffering of malaria, for example? But yeah, if you send me an email, I can send you the one analysis I've seen on that. Mm-hmm.
If you have an animal rights group or you want to do institutional changes,
Mm-hmm.
how would you go? I think one idea I got here today is that it could be, if you want to promote veganism, you probably focus on the how to go vegan or how to reduce meat. If you want to change for institutions, then you can talk to CEOs of big companies and these kind of things. Are there other ways of doing that for ordinary animal rights groups, for example?
Yeah, so are there ways for ordinary animal rights groups to tackle institutions, to get CEOs and these people to change their minds? Definitely. And there are like tons of things that I could say on this, but one of the key things is to collaborate. So there are lots of people in the global sphere now, at least in the past 2 years, trying to coordinate pushes for both new vegan products and for humane reforms from companies and from schools and from hospitals, these sorts of institutions. Specifically, they formed the Open Wing Alliance, started by the Humane League, and that's several European countries are on board. They're starting to get global commitments for cage-free reforms and hoping to move that into other policy areas. So getting in touch with them, they've done trainings in Europe where they've told people like, how do you talk to those CEOs? What other tactics can you use? Is really impactful. But in terms of, what are those tactics? For example, you can do negative campaigning, so you can convince them that their consumers don't want them to have this policy, or sorry, that they do want to have the better policy. So this has been done in many ways, but like protests in front of their headquarters, people refusing to shop there, like boycotting the store, this sort of thing, social media campaigning, like commenting on all of their posts, just saying how bad it is that they use caged eggs, for example. But it's like a tool belt of tactics they can employ, and there's like good cop stuff, there's bad cop stuff, it's all sorts of things. Yeah, I would definitely say collaborate, and I'm sure there are groups in Norway who do this who you could reach out to. And especially if they're working with like dining companies, which are usually a popular target because you can work with college students, then like local groups can really help out with that. So like they just happen to be now tackling the university in my hometown in Texas, and because I took courses there during high school, I'm like able to help out with that by saying, hey, I'm a former student, I'm an alumni of that university technically, so like I really want you to make this change, and that can be really useful for the national group because they don't have like a local person in this random small town that I grew up in.
I want to ask a personal opinion. When we talk about farm animals, we often think about chickens, cows, and pigs. But what's your opinion on farm fish? It just came to my mind this morning. Seems like we live in a country that's full of resources from the ocean, and it's more ideally to eat seafood than vegetables because it doesn't grow that much here, or it doesn't grow very. It's not very effective to grow vegetables here than just farm fish. What's your opinion on eating fish?
Yeah, so what's my opinion on eating fish, especially in Norway, a place where it might be more environmentally sustainable, or at least doesn't require food imports and this sort of thing to eat seafood as much as it does to use the limited land to produce plant foods or vegetables. It's a good question. On the sustainability aspect, I think that there's not a super strong case. And again, it's hard for me to comment on Norway in particular just because I don't know the details. But in other places that I've thought about, and like places in the some places in the U.S. don't have a lot of their own land, so they have to import from other states and this sort of thing. It seems like it's not that big of an issue to use the plant-based options. However, I think from an animal standpoint, which I think is probably the dominant consideration here, just the vast majority of fishing is so bad for those animals that it's probably better to go with the plant-based options. There could be exceptions to this. So for example, oysters are a really curious case because they have very limited nervous systems. They're roughly as sentient, as sophisticated mentally as plants are, as like some trees, because plants can do things like move towards the light, and they show some sort of like basic level of consciousness. That's a big topic we don't have to get into. So maybe for oysters, even though they're technically animals, maybe it's not so bad to eat them. About as bad as eating plants, and you don't have to worry about the issues of killing wild animals in grain farming, for example. So maybe there's some nuance there, but I think it's a small amount of nuance, and overall considering how much those fish suffer, and how, if you care about autonomy and rights, those are being violated. I think, and especially if you consider the argument of, do we want to focus on ending animal farming generally, or do we want to have this really nuanced approach that maybe isn't as catchy, isn't as easy to push for with institutional policies? I think it's pretty strongly against eating fish and trying to encourage more fish relative to plant consumption. Yeah.
I just have a question about like hunting and fishing, because it happens in nature basically, and if humans don't do it, someone else are kind of gonna do it. And even maybe like the ways that humans hunt by shooting animals is a much more humane way of killing than the way that, say, lions hunt. So what's your opinion on hunting?
Yeah. These are huge questions, and I could write essays on all of them. For hunting and for this is hunting ethical, especially considering that when you kill an animal, you might be actually killing them in a more humane way than a predator would or some other cause of death. So I think that's true. That specific claim of killing them is probably a more humane form of death, a less painful form of death with many forms of hunting than their natural form of death is probably true. However, I don't think that's the specific trade-off we face in the wild. So for example, hunting, you're often killing the younger animals, you're killing the more healthy ones, and this can lead to changes in the population. So for example, if you kill an animal in their prime before they've mated and had children, then maybe you're causing now several new animals to be born because they have those food resources and the carrying capacity of the environment. So maybe you're actually increasing the population in some sense because they have to have several young individuals to kind of get to the point of where that healthy adult was. But yeah, you also have the environmental concerns of, sorry, I won't go into that. Yeah, but I think the dominant consideration here, again, talking about, yeah, we have some aspects where maybe there's like a little bit of nuance, but if we accept hunting and if we accept fishing and we accept kind of the violation of rights of these animals, then that's just like opening the floodgates in some sense. It is the way we protect human rights, the way that we ensure that we have a humane society towards other humans is by respecting individual autonomy and individual rights, by not killing each other, even if we kill each other painlessly. So if we accept that for animals that we can kind of take exceptions to these fundamental unalienable rights, then it's a very hard system to actually enforce. Whereas maybe it's better to just unilaterally say like we just shouldn't kill animals. And if I had to explain every time like I say that I'm vegan or I say that I'm vegetarian, they're like, well, I like do it for hunting. Then maybe you'll have somebody who listens to that and says like, oh well, yeah, like your thing is hunting, my thing is like chicken. I eat that. Like you make an exception, shouldn't I be able to make an exception or something? And it's just very hard to have that sort of perceived inconsistency. But yeah, I mean the dynamics of like wild animals with hunting and like how that affects their population and welfare is definitely a complex topic we could talk more about later.
Thanks.
Yeah. It's really relevant for wild caught fish because there's so many of them. Yeah. Go ahead.
Some of the interventions you're talking about is, for example, to go from caged hens to free range hens, or better welfare, improve the welfare. Could that result in the users of animal products think that, okay, but now they have better welfare, and then increase the consumption of animal products?
Yeah, so does the improvement in welfare potentially increase consumption of animal products because people then say, oh, well, the animals are being treated well, I don't have to go vegetarian. So the example that I know a lot better than Norway is Switzerland. Switzerland has, I think it's safe to say, some of the most, probably in like the top 5 for like the most humane animal farming. They still have tons of issues, but they're well ahead of the US and the UK and other places like that. And they do face this issue a lot. So I think it's definitely a concern. Like they'll leaflet people on the streets who will say like, oh no, we're in Switzerland, it's okay. They even did face this in the UK and have recently started to overcome it by just doing investigations of UK farms. Because people would see their footage and they would say, oh, like we're in the UK, we're not the US, we're not China, we treat our animals well, and the footage you have is like clearly from like Mexico. Like it's no evidence that the animals are treated poorly here. So they went out and just did a ton of investigations of UK farms, and of course, because these animals are abused globally, they were able to find evidence that there's vast amounts of suffering. So now they just use UK footage in at least several of their programs. So I think you can do things like that, where you just if people talk about how humane it is, you just tell them about the things that still aren't humane. And if we're still pushing for welfare reforms, we'll still be talking about those. So for example, now in the US, we've gotten a lot of cage-free commitments, and not as many people are now talking about cage-free as the presence of cages as being a really big source of suffering. Instead, they're talking about the next big welfare pushes. They're talking about the fast growth of chickens raised for meat, for example, or like the slaughter of fish. And how unfortunate that is. So I think there's empirical evidence for momentum, and also there are just so many benefits of it in terms of the direct suffering it reduces, in terms of the precedent it sets in society for caring about animals that helps lead to future reforms, that ultimately I think the momentum consideration wins out. Yeah.
You mentioned during the talk that $1 spent on ads could spare as much as 1 to 12 years of animal suffering. And then you also mentioned something about $1 being able to spare 12 to 25 years of suffering. So I wondered, what kind of thought process did you use to arrive at those numbers?
Yeah, let's see. I think I can pretty easily show you a spreadsheet that went into that. Yeah, so the 12 to 28, I think it was that, was for the humane reforms, for the welfare improvements with companies. But if I go to this group's review, and you can do this too if you're curious to learn more, go to the full review, because I know that's where the information is, and go to the resources that are listed. Yeah, these are really long. We're writing them right now this year. Cost effectiveness calculations as a spreadsheet. This is some of the calculations that go into those sorts of estimates. And this is the interesting tab. And this is for corporate outreach in particular. So yeah, this is a spreadsheet that considers how many animals how are animals affected by each of the policy changes that Mercy for Animals in particular has implemented, battery cages to cage-free, etc. We want to consider the relative value of that. So how much suffering does that actually reduce? We think that battery cages are 0.1, whereas tail docking, even though it's very horrible and definitely is a form of suffering, is roughly 1/10 as worrisome as that. We want to consider the number of animals helped. Proportion of impact has to do with several organizations usually run these campaigns together, and we can't just give them all full impact attribution. So they're one of 5 organizations roughly for this. Is it a commitment or an aspiration? So just one of these, a very large one, wasn't an actual commitment by the company. It was just them saying they would like to do this in the future. So we discounted that by a factor of 10. How many years of impact do you expect? This has its own calculations that go into it, but considering, what's the likelihood that they'll rescind on the commitment? What's the likelihood that they would have made it anyway without Mercy for Animals campaign? And then all these things kind of get multiplied through to get a equivalent animal spared. Which is similar to years spared, just considering the lifespan of the individual. And then we kind of sum this up for each of the areas and then divide it by the budget, and we get animals spared. Yeah. And there are other giant spreadsheets on our website to come up with the other numbers, which I'm happy to explain later. Yeah.
We are running out of time. Is it one quick question or something?
I just want to follow up to this one.
Yeah.
If I just do a quick calculation, a broiler chicken in the US lives about 45 days.
Mm-hmm.
And a typical American eats about 200 of them every year.
I'm not sure about that one, but okay.
If I create one vegan through personal interaction, I save 30 years of suffering.
If they are abstaining from that one product for 1 year, yes, that sounds accurate. There are lots of considerations here. So, for example, consumption isn't directly related to production. Sorry, it's not one-to-one related to production. You have economic elasticity. It's 0.63 for chickens raised for meat, I think. So you would divide that. You would discount that by that factor. But yeah, otherwise, that sounds sort of accurate.
Okay. I guess it's not a question.
Yeah. No, I think it illustrates like the huge impact of creating another, vegan, or talking about effective altruism, creating another effective altruist. This is one of the first thoughts that we had whenever we started thinking about how do we most effectively help others in the world. We thought, okay, well, I can go out and earn a lot of money and donate it and do that all quietly, and that's great. But what if I just spend 1 year convincing another person to do that, and then go on vacation, retire in the Bahamas? I've done just as much good, right? If they're going out and doing that and wouldn't have done it otherwise. So yeah, activism can be huge, whether it's through personal interaction or through donations. Very impactful. We have calculators on our website that go into that sort of thing of how many years of animal suffering or how many lives does a vegetarian spare. Yeah. There's also, actually, if you just Google how many animals does a vegetarian save, I think Counting Animals has a really good analysis, which we use on our website.
one question we should have had on this evaluation, if we really want you to sign to write before you leave, is have this lecture changed your mind in any way, or did you get any new ideas, or have you have you changed your mind in any sense? Can you just put some comments on that? Or anyone change your perception of it? Or you thought all of this before? Yeah.
I mean, what changed for me personally was to put more effort in the how-to instead of the why. I've been a vegan for 8 years or so, and can try to inspire my fellow humans. But it's often with the approach of, yeah, it's so horrible what happens, blah, 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 but they don't mind. Yeah. But with more effort on the how-to, like it's really easy. You see, this is a couple of recipes, something like that. It could actually help more. So this I took from the presentation today. Is it might be a way of approaching it differently, more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have another idea. If you on the back side of this paper write if you change your mind in any sense or got a new idea of something on the back side of the paper. You have 1 minute to just summarize if it's something you really want the audience to take from this.
Good question. So the main issue with these talks, I think, from an EA standpoint, is that lots of people listen to them and then say, "Oh, that's cool," and then go back to things and don't actually make changes. This is why I emphasize joining a Facebook group, even though that's not too significant. But definitely put it if you have a to-do list. This is something to put in your to-do list. Is just kind of take action on the talk, and try and do it, not tonight, but a week from now or something. And just absorb the ideas, think about how it should impact your actual course of action, and think about, whether you change your mind on something like this. So, these sorts of talks can sometimes change people from one cause area to another. Maybe you were working on farmed animals and realized my arguments are actually really bad, so now you want to help the global poor, or maybe you were considering earning to give, but now you're really swayed by the idea of, becoming a scientist and creating animal-free food. But just making a commitment to circle back and to actually take action on it, I think is really important. So in a Giving What We Can talk, which is another EA organization, they would emphasize taking the pledge or 80,000 hours, similar sorts of things. But yeah, so just taking action on it. Whether that action is in what direction, doesn't really matter. Just make sure you take action. Yeah.